Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening program by Radboud Reflects and also the Healthy Brain Initiative, which is a campus-wide initiative trying to get together researchers from various disciplines. And today we've had a very fruitful symposium on campus. Maybe some of you were there as well. And tonight we're continuing the conversation about the future of our minds in a digital society. So I'm wondering, maybe some of you have experienced this where you feel like your cognitive capacities are being influenced by the digital tools that you have now. So for example, who feels that maybe their navigation skills have dropped somewhat now that you use turn-by-turn navigation all the time, right? Who feels maybe that it's more difficult to focus on reading a text as your phone is blowing up all the time? Who of you has lowered the amount of notifications that your phone is allowed to send you? Also, so it's a struggle. It's a struggle. Tonight, Professor Emily Murphy will talk about how insights from brain and behavioral science can be used for more than just getting you to buy stuff. She believes there is a future where policymakers use scientific results to prioritize our collective cognitive well-being or even collective cognitive capital. She'll tell us all about that tonight. She's a law professor and a behavioral neuroscientist at University of California, College of the Law in San Francisco. She came a long way, and she might be jet-lagged, but her research focuses on the intersection of neuroscience, behavioral science, and law. So very interdimensional. Yeah, yes. I'll stick with that. So after her lecture, we'll have a panel discussion. Emily will be there, and she will be joined by Tamar, Sharon, who is a professor of philosophical ethics and political philosophy at our university as well, Radboud University. She is also co-director of iHub, the Radboud Interfaculty Center for Research on Digitalization and Society. So she'll have a lot to say about minds in digital worlds as well. And also Alan Sanfey is here. He's a professor and principal investigator at the Donders Institute for Brain Cognition and Behavior. And he heads the decision neuroscience group. So he knows all about how our brains make decisions. That's it for me. Oh, my name is Frank van Kaspel. I'm a philosopher of mind at Radboud University. So, Emily, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much for such a kind introduction and this wonderful invitation. It is really a pleasure to be here because what I have to talk to you tonight about what I think is a very big idea that I want to put out there and get the ball rolling, because it's not an idea I can solve by myself or work on by myself. It's so inherently large and interdisciplinary to think about how do we and how should we value the things that make us most human, the things that make us connected to each other. And it's through our brains. It's through events like this. I am behaving differently right now than I would if I were giving this talk in a practice by myself in my hotel room, because there is an audience. We know that there are audience effects to even the smallest of human behaviors. We're deeply influenced all the time by interacting together in complex and subtle ways. And this is what's really important. And it's also what's being challenged in an increasingly digital society, where we're becoming even more isolated, becoming more ensconced in particular bubbles, perhaps being de-skilled as AI is being asked to do more boring or rote or even more complex tasks for us. So, but given that we have invested millions and millions of dollars, euros and pounds and more in attempting to learn more about ourselves and what makes us most human, what should we do with that information to improve our society? Because isn't that the entire point? I mean, there's study and research for the sake of improving health, for solving disease, for improving well-being of people who are a particularly challenging part of life. But there's also normal life, and there's also normal society, and attempting to improve that. That is what I think is a major point of law, and also the purpose of law is to create our society, to maintain our society, and to govern ourselves. And it's also what we think is the major purpose of doing behavioral and brain science, is to learn about ourselves and to hopefully improve the experience of the human condition. It's those two kind of twin principles that animate my work. I am a a behavioral neuroscientist by original training, and then through a series of interdisciplinary turns, ended up in law school and as a law professor, where I get a chance to think about these big questions. And so I'm going to talk to you today about what I think is a simple but also radical framing idea that I'm calling collective cognitive capital. And it's a framing idea, so defining each of those terms will be important, because it's ultimately a big idea, and trying to make big ideas really concrete, it involves a particular choice of framing and of words. So we'll talk about why those are the particular terms I've chosen, but the fundamental thesis of the idea is that we should be using brain and behavioral science to make decisions and then evaluate those decisions about how we govern ourselves and how we achieve what government is ideally supposed to do, which is promote the general welfare of all people. And I think we should be doing this in the first instance by evaluating how public policy decisions at every level of public policy, how they affect the brain functioning, really the cognitive and emotional functioning of the people, and not people as individuals, people as a collective, people as a big collective, as a small collective, because those are the kinds of functions that we actually care most about. Those are the kinds of functions in which we are both most involved in the human experience and experience the most consequential parts of our lives. So I'm going to lay out this concept and really invite you to join in its development. As you'll see, there's the concept that is a framing concept, but what follows from that is mostly a bunch of questions about how we should think about these really hard problems. So I do want to say, it's not a complete theory of everything, as much as I wish I would be able to come up with something like that, but no one has yet. And it's not really a model in the sense that it doesn't provide either predictions or complete explanations of phenomena, nor does it provide the absolute and complete basis on which we should make policy decisions. But what I think it does by trying to bring these fields together is offer a way to expand research traditions. I mean, we come up, if you're trained in the sciences, you come up in a research tradition, whether you realize it or not, with a set of assumptions and a set of methods and a set of tools that you apply to the problems at hand. And it takes a lot to look outside of one's research tradition because those assumptions are so core as to be difficult to question. But I think a frame shift can help with that. And it's also an invitation to develop new methods and a challenge that we may need to be asking even harder questions than we're currently able to tackle, such as how do we measure things like collective and shared attention, collective learning, collective or dynamic emotional regulation. Doing those things across groups of people is methodologically really hard, but it's probably also the most important. So I think what this promises is, besides an expansion of research questions, in this merging of the sciences and the policy, is a more broader societal reimagining of what is actually core valuable, is at core most valuable to being human and in a society, and importantly, in doing so with possible concepts and even metrics other than money. Because that's the language policymakers tend to speak right now, at least in the United States, and it's even mandated to think about all government decisions through an economic analysis. It was not always this way. It has been mandated to be that way since President Reagan's administration, but it has not always been thus, and maybe it's almost time for a new concept of what is valuable and what is important and what should be prioritized. So I'm not the only person working with this kind of idea. Mine is called collective cognitive capital, but there's European consortia and United States folks working in other areas that they're calling brain capital, and it's all kind of merging toward this frame shift of like there's something more important and fundamental going on here. But before we get to the terminology, I want to tell you just a little bit about how I got to this point, because people say, where did you come from with these ideas? The start of law and neuroscience, which is where my interdisciplinary training is, the field, if we can call it that, really started around in the early aughts, around 2003. In a final year undergraduate class I took with a very famous neuroscientist, Stephen Kosselin, psychologist and neuroscientist, and now infamous law professor Alan Dershowitz. And the class was called The Law and the Brain, and it was premised, and I am not making this up, on the movie Minority Report. And so if we could use brain science to perfectly predict behavior, what result for law? Do we pre-punish people? And law and neuroscience since those early days has mostly been working in the realm of the courtroom, and particularly the criminal courtroom. Questions of evidence. Is this brain scan admissible? Does this brain scan prove that someone had prior knowledge? Does this brain scan prove that they could not have had the capacity to form the requisite mental state to hold them responsible for their actions? Early theorists in this area argued even that brain science would mean that certain questions in criminal law would be completely upended, that we would understand the mechanical nature of human decision-making and then being retributive, wanting to punish someone for the sake of getting back at them would make no more sense, that we would think of people who had committed crimes like cars with broken brakes, needing fixing rather than punishment. This didn't happen, nor do I think it will happen, but that's where most of the early work started, and then it moved to, but generally a courtroom focus. But the courtroom is not where most of us experience law, hopefully. Not where, it's just statistically speaking, most of us are not likely to be in a courtroom. Courtrooms are where disputes are resolved, and courtrooms where, really in the United States, we have so few cases actually go to trial, we can almost think of them as the edge cases. They're no longer the kind of daily problems that people have. So it just didn't have that much of an impact, and we're not seeing as much uptake of neuroscience in kind of evidentiarily problematic ways. And I think we're proud of that because those brain scans can't be used in diagnostic ways for mental states. That's an important thing that we've accomplished. But there's more, right? At the same time, separate from law and neuroscience, there's been this entirely separate movement, probably having touched most of your lives, of nudging, right? Law became law, but behavioral public policy or behavioral economics. The idea that through small changes, we can get people to make better decisions without removing their capacity to actually choose, without removing their freedom. And the philosophical idea underneath this is called libertarian paternalism. We're going to have an idea of what's a better choice for you, of what foods to select or where to allocate your retirement savings. But we'll let you choose nonetheless. We'll set defaults differently. Extremely popular, right? You've probably read the books, Nudge. You've been nudged as a Dutch citizen, I believe. And very, very hot, having no touching at all on what laws actually should be. Was never designed that way. Was always designed with the individual, like changing the individual person, rather than questioning, should the system be set up this way at all? It takes a view of how people relate to law as well, as a view that's very consistent with what we would call market fundamentalism, which some people call neoliberalism, despite the squishiness of that term, the price theory, and core concerns, again, about efficiency. There's economics kind of underneath it all. It's an improvement over classical economics in that it doesn't assume that people behave rationally. It recognizes that we have biases. We use heuristics to make decisions. We are imperfect and irrational decision makers. But as applied to policy, I believe the emerging consensus that I agree with is that because it's a theory of how people act and not a theory that considers their capacities for how to do so, that its impact has been pretty minimal. Is something falling from the ceiling? I can barely see all of you, but it's snowing inside. It's actually had pretty modest policy results in getting individuals to behave different or better. It turns out to have had pretty minimal impact in kids' school lunch choices. It's turned out to have pretty minimal impact in default retirement savings in the United States, where we have very limited social safety net for or pension programs. It's really good at getting Britons to pay their taxes on time, and I'm sure they're thrilled about that. But the effect sizes are small and marginal, and maybe that's the intent. But what it doesn't do and has never done is enable a kind of questioning or critique of the status quo of this really intense focus on individualism and how individuals interact with their lives and with their government policies. And it just also doesn't have any adequate model for biological interventions that affect human behavior. It left entirely to the side the kind of questioning of how does nutrition, how do toxins, how does global warming and climate change affect the capacities of humans to act? So, nevertheless, still influential. But of course, there's so much more to behavioral science than either deciding whether an individual should be criminally responsible or trying to get them as an individual to make better decisions about changing out into energy-efficient light bulbs. Important, but small. And so I think there's room to use what we're learning from brain and behavioral science to make the systems better in the first place. And this is where I started, right? This is arguably the major point of doing all this expensive research, and also the point of having democratic self-governance. I think that behavioral and brain science can have a greater impact on law and policy, and I also think it's critical that we recognize that law is one of the social determinants of brain health. And so these things reciprocally interact. So they come together in this idea that I'm calling collective cognitive capital. And so let's talk about each of those terms. I'll explain at first what I think it is, and then how I think it would work, and then what I think it requires from researchers, but really also from law and policymakers and from the public to get the ball rolling, to get buy-in, to try to use what we're learning to improve ourselves in the face of risks, and in both existential risks, but also in the face of risks of the digital society, whether we fully understand them or not. So, here we go. Collective cognitive capital is a way of thinking about brain health and brain function as an aggregated resource. So it's a conceptual framework for synthesizing what data we do have, and then figuring out what data we need to have, and using it to make policy choices and then assess the impacts of those policy choices. When I first started with this project, I initially wrote that such policies should seek to maximize our collective cognitive capital, because I think it's something that has inherent or intrinsic value. It's what's important to a society. I'm starting to modify that to talk more about optimizing collective cognitive capital, but that's squishier. And so we'll get to that at the end when we talk about some of the challenges here. But I think that it's important as an intrinsically valuable thing because good quality cognitive and emotional functioning and overall brain health, especially collectively, because there's a lot of individual variability, which is probably desirable, but collectively subserves and then maximizes agency and freedom. They're also what give us these capacities for these essential human experiences that probably should be ever more precious in a digital society. So let's talk about each of the terms, starting with the last one. Capital. This is the term I get the most pushback on because it's such a loaded term, and it's being used as a metaphor here. I said this is a resource. But the choice of capital is a deliberate one, using economic policy language. And I'm coming at this from the pragmatic viewpoint. I want to shift the conversation away from money and GDP and efficiencies, economic efficiencies, as being the core metrics and values by how we measure our society. But we're not going to shift that just by saying we should talk about brain health instead, because our policymakers understand and speak the language of capital. Law creates capital. Law codes resources as valuable. Law creates something like private property. Without law, you don't have private property. You don't have intellectual property. You don't have value in the economic sense. And capital, in the form of wealth and resources and natural resources, both directly and indirectly just dominates mainstream legal and policy analysis. I don't think there's any getting away from it as a concept. And we're familiar with extensions that sociologists have developed over decades now of concepts such as human capital and cultural capital and social capital. And some of those we think about as being marketable, human capital, our own investment in our education and our work capacities. But ecological economists also use a concept of natural capital, that boats and nets, for example, are easily recognized as what economists would consider capital equipment. but they would point out that the fish in the sea are also an essential resource that is used again and again in production and is renewed. And capital does convey that this resource, our collective brain health, our collective brain capacities, it requires investment to gain productivity. We have to educate. We have to acquire language during critical periods. These require investments. It's capable of growth. This is arguably the entire point of education. And it's subject to fluctuations in surrounding conditions, periods of stress that we individually go through. And I'm speaking about it on an individual level because I think we can all understand and appreciate it that way. And it's definitely harmed by underinvestment or withdrawals, such as neglect or extreme trauma, extreme continuous stress, health problems, nutritional deficiencies, toxins, lead paint, for example, and brain injury. These things are all going to impact whether or not the resource can be fully renewed, can be fully restored. And I think the metaphor is imperfect, but I'm still think it's an important one. The reason I get pushback is because many people think the idea of capital implies an exchangeability, like a marketability, that it becomes something that we can transact. And they really resist this idea that we should be using our brain capacities and our brain resources transactionally. And I understand that, but I think nevertheless, there's a part of the sort of resource aspect to it that it's hard to not speak the language of capital, and also, I think, an important frame to reach policymakers. So let's go to the middle term, cognitive. This is meant capaciously. I'm taking liberties with the definition of cognitive because I think the alliteration of collective cognitive capital sounds nice. And things sounding nice is an important way to appeal to legislators and policymakers who are very busy and have lots of things on their minds. But what I would call cognitive, we could define broadly as derived from brain states. This includes not just cognitive, maybe you might think of as like number crunching skills or domains such as attention or executive function or shifting your attention from one thing to another, but also what are termed in the literature as non-cognitive skills such as emotional and social regulatory abilities. And I think we're starting to see the collapse between this binary of cognition and emotion, but it's still prevalent throughout society, and I want to be expansive in the definition that we're using here. The actual contents of what we would look at in terms of data, in terms of both research concepts and then experimental paradigms that would help us think about, okay, what goes into these buckets? I categorize them initially, and I think I'm sticking with this, into 4 kind of broad domains of behavioral and brain research, some of which we know much more about than others. 2 are kind of biological, and here I would talk about brain development, which we actually do know quite a lot about. Brain plasticity, which we know exists, but the mechanisms are still being explored. And then on the other end, usually of the lifespan, but something like what we call cognitive reserve, which is resilience to change in the face of normal aging or in the face of neuropathology. And as well as resilience more generally. This is something we actually know very little about. There's been different waves of resilience research, but it's very hard to do. But it is a critical component of this because we know it exists at some level, and it also is what I think can give us fundamental hope, because the risk of conceptualizing and bringing in really truly biological components of that we are embodied biological beings, bringing in biological measures contains within it a risk of essentializing and reducing and making people feel as if things are fixed or stuck, right? That if something is hardwired, I mean, the common lay conception of DNA as being kind of hardwired, we know that there are components that are of our biologies that are fixed, but we know so much more now about how environments modify those things. Well, if we were to adopt if a framework like this were to be adopted that said, look, we can assess and track children from an early age and decide that this group has more cognitive capital than this group, and there will be no particular changes, or there's maximal capacities, that could lead to some not great places in terms of equality of opportunity. not necessarily equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. And that's something I resist. And so I think that I resist that on kind of normative justice grounds, but also on scientific grounds. Because what we don't know enough about resilience. I'd have to be open to the idea that science might tell us some people are more resilient than others. And if we had predictions about who was more resilient than others, what the implications of that could be. But as a complete descriptive project, but also as a hopeful project, we need to think that we're capable of changing our brains. And there's so much evidence that we are. We just don't know yet exactly how. The other two domains are what I think behavioral scientists would consider more functionalist. And these are areas in which we actually do have quite a lot more data, although it's not perfect, and we don't always have it at the levels of, or the level of populations that we would want, but measures of something like general intelligence and fluid reasoning, kind of ability to think dynamically, as well as measures of cognitive control. And this is the area that I came up in through my PhD program. Things like attentional control, inhibitory control, stopping doing something is as important as being able to do things, and social and emotional regulatory abilities. We actually have quite sophisticated experimental models to study these and to study the underlying mechanisms and to assess them, not just at a neuroscience level, really fundamentally at a behavioral level. And so these four domains that I've talked about, the two biological and the two kind of functional, are how I would bucket the absolutely staggering amount of behavioral and brain science research that we actually already have. But these original categories also reflect the research tradition and the assumptions that I came up in of something with cognition as something more definitely as taking place inside the skull of an individual, and perhaps in modular pieces, and maybe even mechanical, that we can study them piecemeal one at a time and kind of fit them together. I'm now expanding this concept and taking lessons really from philosophers of mind who've written much more expansively about what they call wide theoretical perspectives on cognition. So shared cognition, like we're probably having now. Relational agency, the concept of embedded or extended or enacted cognition, extended cognition through the use of, for example, of devices or through the use of systems around us. Embodied cognition, the inherent idea that it's not just happening in our brains, it's happening through all the sensory receptors that we get into our brains, and especially with respect to the production and the cultural production of emotion. And what are essentially inherently collaborative and collective brain functions. And so this is a nice transition. I'm still very much learning about these things. They're very, very hard to study empirically. Studying shared attention and things like that, you have to have more people available. You still have to create experimental features where you can kind of isolate what you think the construct you're trying to study. But if those constructs exist not as aggregated properties, but as dynamic and interrelational properties, that's fuzzier. That's harder for us to do. We might need to think about new methods. But the collective, this just emphasizes to me that collective is a non-negotiable part of this concept, that it can't and shouldn't be individualized. It's definitely easier to study at an individual level, and it's probably easier to sit when we're in a quiet moment and really feel ourselves as an independent, isolated agent. But that's wrong for two reasons, or just not wrong, but not complete, for two reasons. And the first is that it's probably these interpersonal aspects of cognition that are the most meaningful and the things we actually care the most about, and that most touch on questions of societal governance. I would go so far as to say I don't think I can think of very few examples of human effort or endeavors that have accomplished something singularly as the product of one person's cognition. Everything is edited, everything is collaborated, everything is taught, everything is learned, everything is shared. Infants don't learn by being in their own minds, they learn through shared dynamics and children with their caregivers. So that's the things we care about. But even if we stick to those four original categories that I was thinking of, we need to be thinking about the normal and subtle behaviors that most of us are dealing with in our daily lives and the range of those behaviors across the course of the lifespan. And we need to be thinking about that at a population level, because it's become quite clear that to make sense of behavior and to make sense of subtle differences in behavior and to try to make any sense of the brain and behavior relationship, we are now needing to do what is being called population neuroscience, because we're so different from each other, we're so heterogeneous that in any kind of assessment, there's a lot of noise. And to get signals out of noisy data, you need huge amounts of data. And to perceive differences in what are really truly very small effect sizes when measured across a population, we need a lot of data. So we both need to do this at a population level to think about this as an aggregated resource. But we also need to keep this at the level of the collective, because it's our shared cognition that is most important. That said, defining groups is one of the many challenges that this framework, there's an inherent risk in this, because defining which groups to assess or measure or value in different contexts is fundamentally a values-based and possibly a power-based decision. People belong to many different groups. We call this intersectionality. They construct their identities as a member, and that identity shifts between groups in different times. So this is not an easy task either. Nothing I have set out for us to do so far is easy. But I think it's very important that if any kind of focus of research and any kind of metric development is collective, because if we're applying it to policy, it's collective outcomes that are what we would call the coin of the realm. That's what matters. Policymakers are not adjudicating individual disputes. That's for the courts. But the way we all touch law and the way law touches us is really at the level of collective outcomes. So that's what it is. How would it work? I'm not sure. But I think that a huge amount of this early work is just framing it in such a way that we can conceptualize that we might get a significant amount of societal value just by orienting ourselves as a society, as a culture, and particularly our governments to think of this collective brain health and capacity as a key priority to have a thriving population in a digital society. That frame might be different depending on the particular target audience. So it could be framed, and this will lead to some of the examples that I think this will cash out in. But I think that, for example, people who are politically liberal might take from this frame that more collective cognitive capital will create more collective empathy and more egalitarianism. Conservatives might be sold on the idea that more collective cognitive capital might create more self-reliance, the ability, the capacity to create personal responsibility, down at the individual level perhaps, or at the level of the family. Nations might think of collective cognitive capital as important to the national defense, that with greater collective cognitive capital becomes less vulnerability or susceptibility to misinformation or disinformation. And nations may also think of it as a matter of economic competitiveness in a world that is moving towards automation of manual labor and much more knowledge-based work. And political purists may think that this frame could give us more deliberative, more rational decision-making, and maybe a citizenry kind of better equipped for self-rule. So that you could see how the framing could lead us to do different opportunities and different examples. How do we do this? This might be hard to do, but possible to try to create some sort of index or indicator to assess what is the impact, what is our current status of the collective cognitive capital of a particular group, what is the impact of a given policy intervention. That's possible. I think it would be a very complex statistical model. It would requiring group-based data, which is going to be inherently messy. And again, I think that especially if we're reflecting on kind of expanding the research traditions, but taking that data and distilling it down into something that is going to be simple to grasp and policymakers can use is a challenge that I think even the best minds of this kind of work, the WHO in the United States, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, they have a project on trying to assess a global metric to to evaluate early childhood brain health. And they're finding it like very technically demanding. Because anytime you start to measure something, that's the thing, then that's starts to drive the policy, even if you've made the wrong choice in the first instance. So there's risk there. So it may not be possible or desirable to create something like a single indicator. It might be that we'd use a group of experts type model. This has been proposed in the United States in administrative law context, that this group of experts will look at the best available information and, without needing to distill it to a final, analogous to economic metric, make a consensus-based decision about the likely effects or impacts or causal impacts of a given policy. But there's so much risk, so it's largely still conceptual. So I want to talk a little bit more about what do we think this does when applied to questions of law and policy. Well, I've argued that I think it's both inherently as well as instrumentally valuable, and that it's necessary probably for democratic self-governance, as well as a guide to doing this interdisciplinary research, possibly a replacement of an analytical tool like cost-benefit analysis, moving us beyond strictly economic measures. But how does it work in practice? Well, I think we can see a few examples of this, of current governance problems through this frame. So something in the United States that's called administrative burdens, that are kind of necessary citizen-state interactions, like when I have to file my taxes. Incredibly onerous task in the United States. Our government pushes so much of paperwork, despite paperwork reduction acts, and individual responsibility for interacting with the government onto citizens. This is identified by some researchers as a catch-22 because, in fact, the citizens who most need to interact with the government to get benefits, to which they are by law entitled, have to do very cognitively demanding things. When they are poor and they need food benefits or when they need child benefits, they need to do this enormous amount of paperwork and go to meetings and get there at the right time and arrange childcare, hugely cognitively burdensome, that both the people who are most in need of state assistance are subjected to things that most undermine their cognitive resources. Now, I was delighted to see when I was doing this initial research that the Dutch government is trying to fix this by adopting the recommendations of, let me just get the wording right here, the Scientific Council for Government Policy, in adopting what they call a capacity to act test, which asks the key question, I'm just reading here from the report, is the legislation based on realistic assumptions about people's mental resilience? It's got process questions, it's got content questions about imposed mental burdens, cumulative burdens, the consequences of what happens if they make a mistake, and that there's examples that I'd love to learn more about of suggested changes to the Child Care Allowance Act, to various income support schemes, to how a pension should be divided in a marital separation, and excitingly for me, a new subsidized legal aid system to be delivered this year. We have nothing like this in the United States. We have an executive order that's a little bit aspirational of removing the sludge, the kind of things that gum up the works for citizen-state interactions, but the government is not applying a similar capacity to act test. But I love this. And I think it's because it takes seriously the cognitive capacities of individuals and of groups of people who most need to interact with the state. And we should ask ourselves, should the state be allowed to impose those burdens on us? Why does that, should the state have to have a very good reason if it's going to tax effectively the collective cognitive capacity of a group of people, particularly if that tax is regressive and inequitable? Just maybe two more examples. One, this is a particular way that the framing, I think, would appeal to conservatives, which I'm coming from California, probably one of our most progressive states, and I've got a project trying to use this idea to create a children's right to healthy brain development. And if it can happen anywhere in the United States, it can only happen in California. And yet we are still very fiscally conservative, and we have a deep cultural stigma against social welfare programs and accepting those programs. And in red states, states run by Republicans, We have deep antipathy to these programs because they are viewed as giving money to people who are undeserving, who need to work. Instead, we have very onerous work requirements to receive subsidized healthcare, even those very few people who do receive it. But if social welfare programs were reframed as investment in the collective cognitive capital of the population at a universal level, it might sell a little bit better. I know this is sort of, I'm preaching to a Western European audience here where these programs are much more robust than we have in the United States, but framing it as a capital investment could be both a cultural and political shift that would be more holistic than a cost-benefit analysis, or even really a hedonic or like well-being analysis, because we could say this is an investment that frees up recipients of this money to do other activities that conservatives care about. Self-determination, better and increased caregiving, investment in social relationships, the pursuit of education and training and meaningful, well-compensated work, because they're not laboring under the extreme cognitive burdens of figuring out whether they're going to pay their grocery bill or their light bill. The last example is really one that touches all of us universally about climate change and the environment. We are now, and it's a problem that we're starting to solve, but not fast enough, and this is outside of my expertise, but again, we have so much resistance on economic grounds that this is going to be too costly, it's going to destroy jobs. But if we recognize what the data is showing us, that air pollution, warming due to climate change, warming in classrooms is being shown to have direct and measurable effects on brain function and mental health. These are not things that behavioral economics can nudge people out of. You could say, well, you can move out of your area with polluted air. That's not a nudge, that's a shove. And it's not a shove that most people have the opportunity to do. Law and policy in the deriving from law and behavioral economics really only nibbles around the edges of this topic, such as like research into changing consumer behavior about energy use and nudging people to purchase goods with less environmental impact. But it says nothing at all about structural policies like developing alternative energy sources. But we do this in the United States on an economic basis and not on a health basis. It's not enough to talk about the physical health of people, the rates of asthma from air pollution. It just hasn't moved the needle. So maybe we try talking about it in terms of brain health, in terms of our children's brain health and their ability to grow what is an essential national resource of collective cognitive capital. Converting brain health and functioning to dollar or euro or pound values, especially in an increasingly knowledge-based economy, is extremely challenging, although an exercise we're familiar with, but also, I would argue, fundamentally dehumanizing. And I think that this framework of collective cognitive capital provides an alternative and more deeply humane way of understanding the toll of environmental insults on the human experience. There's lots and lots of risks to this. There are risks, and those risks really track along the same categories of any time we try to bring in science to policy. There are immediate dark sides. That's why it cannot be the only form of decision-making and of governance. But we need to consider those risks as well as those challenges. I think I want to wrap up with the challenges and then end on a note of hopeful optimism as we head into the conversation about the future of mind and the digital society. But one of those risks is how we're going to resolve it when liberties and autonomy conflicts with collective goods. Now, this is a very strong theme in the US, and I think also international concerns with cognitive liberties, or what some people are calling neuro rights, the right to think freely, the right to possess our own data, and the right to be free from interference, and the right to our own self-determination of our minds may actually demand such degrees of autonomy that have collective costs. So how do we weigh these? And you think about things like the TikTok ban that the United States government, federal government, is now attempting to enact, or that some states have enacted, or restrictions on access to opioids, things that are collectively bad, but where there's individual examples of good, of thriving. How do we make collective decisions when there is this heterogeneity, and that at some level individual liberty demands respecting that heterogeneity and individual people's autonomy, their ability to make these decisions for themselves. It might be that there's some collective liberty claims in safeguards against manipulation and disinformation, and I'd be interested to talk about that with the panelists later today. What are the challenges? There are many, not even to mention risks, but just challenges. Measurements are disputed. They're hard to define precisely, and whoever decides what these measurements are is in a position, whether they realize it or not, of potentially great power. This is true for all kinds of measurements. It's a challenge to whether we should define and understand this as an intrinsic good in and of itself or an instrumental good in the service of ideas that create other kinds of welfare. Is it both? Can it be both at the same time? If we talk about maximizing this, that could potentially lead to some dark places. Minimizing sludge, we're working on that. What about optimizing? And I was saying I was modifying my thinking about this. Optimizing is a real buzzword, right? Like it's very squishy to decide. Again, who decides what's optimal? But we probably need to optimize, especially in this digital society, in light of extended interactions with technology and the development of AI that are both supplementing and also in some ways supplanting human thinking. What is the optimal deployment of that in a learning context? What is the optimal deployment of that in our education system, in our schools? What are the core skills and values that we need to think about? On one hand, AI is already perhaps freeing us from cognitive burdens and loads that we don't like doing, like drafting an email for you that you've been stressing out about, giving you the first draft of that. Fantastic use of AI, right? But does it risk stunting certain capabilities without creating desirable difficulties? And I think about this as an educator. I worry about my law students producing output, but not developing the skills and the judgment, which is what law really demands of a skilled attorney. There's probably some degrees of stress and pressure necessary. I'm not saying that we should be maximizing or optimizing collective cognitive capital as hedonic well-being all the time, that pressure and stress, and even to some degree, traumas that are an inherent part of the human experience drive growth. They drive personal growth. They drive relationship growth. They drive new innovation and new ideas, and therefore may be fundamentally instrumental goods. So avoidance of all negatives is probably not even the right thing if we were to try to maximize. There's also distributive concerns. If we are treating this as an asset or a resource, is it something that can be taxed? Probably. Is it something that can be redistributed? And is it a zero-sum game because of the inputs that would be required to go into it? Or is there some way to make some people better off and not make other people's worse off? Or do we inherently risk, as we already do, investing in some groups and not in others? And particularly, what about groups that we treat as outcasts? Incarcerated persons or outgroup members, especially outgroup with respect to the state, so non-citizens or migrants, the unhoused, people without political voices, and in the US I would include children who have no rights, almost, whose parental or subsumed by almost absolute parental rights. How do we balance those against each other? This doesn't give us a theory of that. There's other theories of justice that need to be continually weighed in. How do we go forward? If we're going to have metrics, we have to co-design them. This is such an interdisciplinary project. It's so far. I need 3 or 4 more PhDs in different subject areas to even fully grapple what I'm kind of introducing here. But in order to do this, we have to build interdisciplinary trust. We have to build interdisciplinary familiarity across methodologies and to question assumptions, but you have to have trust to question another discipline's assumptions. We have to build community trust, that this is a value, that we can't live in a society where we are isolated into ourselves and it's every person for themselves. It's actually just descriptively not how this works. But in times of extreme turmoil, in faces of extreme threats, that it's a very natural reaction to say, you know what, it's my cognitive capital that matters, or my families, or my immediate in-groups. But that's not how a society works. We have to be still careful, though, about homogenizing groups and welcoming and being open to, not just as a value, but as a descriptive matter, figuring out how the heterogeneity, the diversity, and the neurodiversity actually contribute to a strong and thriving society. I think that what this ultimately does is bring brain and behavioral science, at least into the discourse of political power, where it's really not been before. And we're trying to do that incrementally by using existing policy discourse of capitalism, but as kind of a Trojan horse, right? As a means of shifting the values away from the purported neutrality of economics and the market towards a hopefully different kind of truly more neutral, if there ever is such a thing, as the means of human flourishing, creating the means of human flourishing, the capacity to think and feel and socially engage and pursue goals and pleasures and determine the course of one's life, creating the ability and protecting the rights to do so freely and deliberately and collectively. This is what I fundamentally see as the project of governance and of building scientific understanding of how our brains work and how behavior actually happens. And I feel like we're racing the clock, but this problem is really hard. It's probably a long game of slow and publicly funded science and trusted science. But the challenge is, of course, meeting the moment we're already in, where digital society and AI technologies are racing ahead of what we know, when there's so much unknown and there's so potentially so much risk in ceding our minds to the machine that it's even hard to define what those risks are. But I look forward to the conversation about it. Thank you.
Emily, thank you so much for your inspiring lecture. And I must say, I don't feel like you are like most other scientists, in the sense that you're unyieldingly multidisciplinary. So you have a very explicit call for interdisciplinary collaboration. And you say you want to introduce this new concept, this new rallying cry of collective cognitive capital. Mm-hmm. Maybe to bring this home to our Dutch audience, would it be correct to say that in this scenario where if we have an election coming up and we have many political parties, sorry,
we only have two. It's much
okay.
Yeah.
So,
too many.
Too many. Well, so what some of our parties do or can do, there's a government office that calculates through their party programs. So before the election comes up, they can turn over their party programs, and then this government agency goes through it and sees what the effects would be in terms of economic growth, in terms of spending power for certain demographics.
We have something like this in the Congressional Budget Office, sort of assessing what would be and we have it at state levels too, like what would be the impact of proposed legislation. So I take it, it's like a party's platform. Yeah. They assess the impact of that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Like yeah. And so would you say that collective cognitive capital could be a metric that is added to?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So
I would
something
love
like
that.
Yeah.
And probably alongside economic measures, but especially treating it as separate and not supplanting and not trying to reduce collective cognitive capital down to something like GDP and saying what's the impact, but saying how would this party's platforms and policies affect your experiences as a family, as a society, as a school, from the perspective of the things that make you able to think and feel and interact and make decisions about your own life.
But I see it's difficult because not everybody knows, but it feels like economic growth is easy in a sense. You can get an objective measure of what economic growth is, although of course I know that if there's an economist in the room.
I mean, it's easy if you make a lot of simplifying assumptions.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. But what collective cognitive capital is so far it's very hard to determine, I suppose. This is exactly why you're here, because you're saying I need input from many different areas of science to figure out what this concept could be.
Yes.
And so how do you get all these different scientists together?
I'm starting with this project in California that I alluded to, funded by the state, which will be interesting to see what they do with it. That is as a working group model that I'm bringing together developmental psychologists, developmental neuroscientists, child advocacy groups, the foremost experts on children's rights in the United States and other kind of rights-based experts, as well as experts in administrative law to think about what would this right, how could we operationalize this? And the two main research questions for this working group are, one, could we reach some sort of consensus on what healthy brain development means, and how would we assess that? And two, could we protect that with law? And what would be the kind of expressive content of that law, and what would be the enforcement content of that law? These are really hard problems. Collective rights are largely aspirational. They work better in some countries than others. We don't have them in the United States. We have very few what we would call positive or affirmative rights, things that the state owes to us. We're mostly a country of negative rights, the things the state can't do to us. But if law is a social determinant of health, I think we have to try very hard to see if we can use it as a tool.
And so you're getting researchers from various areas together. You also said you need more and more PhDs.
Yeah.
And so I assume there's neuroscientists like Alan. Are there also philosophers like Tamar?
You know, I haven't had enough philosophers yet, although I have people with dual degrees who don't practice as philosophers but who have training. But I probably I'm realizing I need to expand this. The first meeting is in June. Do you want to come? Of philosophers of mind to say, like, here's the research we need to do next. I think the philosophers might be better at helping us figure out the next set of research questions for brain and behavioral science. And I think this first stage is trying to think about what could we do on the ground right now. But the next several rounds of this, for children, especially in the state of California, given the political realities there, it's less a question of ought and more a question of how.
Yeah. So Tamar, I suppose you see a role for philosophers in discussions like these?
There's a role for philosophers in all discussions.
We always need philosophers.
She wants a philosopher of mind, though.
Oh, okay, I'll go.
Sure, but on so many levels, right? I mean, one thing philosophers are very good at, I think one thing they can contribute is framing. Mm-hmm. And so that's something you're very busy with. Mm-hmm. And so there would be a lot to do there around framing. I think thinking about concepts too, so you mentioned this a little bit, but if you're thinking about something of how some of this might conflict or come into tension with autonomy mm-hmm. and freedom, and of course in the United States it's a big discussion, but that's one we have everywhere. I think there's a lot to be done if you would throw a political philosopher in there to say, yes. Well, you know, there's kind of two big ways to think about freedom, and we can think about it in negative terms, and that's a form of freedom that we tend to fall back on. It's also been kind of appropriated by mm-hmm. the right yes. in terms of don't mess with my bubble, and that's when I'm free. But you could also try to cultivate an understanding of freedom and autonomy, which is a more positive conception of it, to say, mm-hmm. well, I am not free so long as, you know, there are school shootings yeah. in my city every other year. Right. And I am not free so long as there's a pandemic running around and people aren't wearing face masks. And so what are the conditions that allow us to practice and enact our freedom and autonomy? And that's quite a different approach, which I think would work well with the collective yeah. cognitive capital.
So demand a massive cultural shift in the United States.
Yeah, but yeah. It's always interesting to me how values and concepts like freedom or autonomy tend to be appropriated by the right or left in the political arena. And there's a lot of work to do there, which is just the work of language and rhetoric and building a story around this. And how do we take back freedom,
yeah.
for example?
I think I'm trying to take back capital in some ways.
Yeah, that one I would be a little bit nervous about. So I have to say that I would be there, and yeah, I would prefer calling it something else than capital. It might be a European view, but we could speak about value, for example. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. value can be economic, but can also be cultural. It can
I like that.
There's all kinds of value that can be generated. But yeah, there's a lot to be done with language, and I know you're very busy with framing, so some philosophers could help out there.
Absolutely. We definitely have ethicists as who often are trained as philosophers, but neuroethicists, and because of the inherent risks of any kind of biopolitical project, like I alluded to, they go to very dark places very quickly, and so spotting those problems, no one has the intentions of doing that, of being, for example, ableist and kind of excluding people with various neurodiversities and saying that's not contributing to collective cognitive capital, that's not valuable, and if you don't reach some sort of threshold, that there's risks of exclusion or further exclusion or marginalization, and the neuroethicists are helping us spot those issues and foreground them. I don't think they're solvable. I think they're manageable.
Right, so there's certainly something to do for philosophers as well. Maybe briefly, Alan, so you're a neuroscientist, you study how we make decisions. Do you feel like your work, I mean, obviously it connects to what Emily's trying to do. Do you feel like your research can or has even helped us think of ways to manage our society that help us make good decisions?
I think a couple of aspects that decision-making research, broadly construed, have contributed to this and echo some of the points Emily made is the demonstration that we do care about things beyond economic values. So, classical economic theory and rational choice theory kind of presupposes we choose in accordance with that which will give us the biggest gain, which is often in a monetary sense. However, we know from lots and lots of research that we care about other things. So we care about pro-social behavior, we care about altruism, and we see it in experiments and we see it in everyday life. We often act towards the benefit of others, even when it comes at a cost to ourselves. We care about cooperative action, we get value from cooperation, we care about community. So these are things that we see clearly in our decisions every day, but which often aren't taken into account when we think about the GDP of a country or society, and perhaps we should be looking at GDCP, the domestic cognitive product. So they've got capital, product, and values.
Yeah.
Many terms to choose from. And so I think that's one aspect that decision-making research has demonstrated very, very clearly, that we care about these non-monetary, non-economic gains. And so I think it's important that we factor those in to our policies, and they should be also determining the policies we make. So I'm not sure to what degree that's increasing capital, or I mean it's related, but it's also slightly different, that these are values that we care about and should be factored in.
So maybe a very specific example. So would this be an example of a policy that increased collective cognitive capital using neuroscience, maybe even using some of the research that you're doing at iHub? We've talked about this during dinner, but the ban on mobile phones in high schools in the Netherlands. So would this be a policy that you would support, or would this be in line with your ideals, or is this increasing the collective cognitive capital of our kids in high schools? Do you have some idea? Yeah, do you have some ideas?
I do. So this was relatively new to me, this concept of collective cognitive capital. But now that I know it, I would say that a policy like that would certainly increase something like collective cognitive capital. What I really like about the policy, and I have a son who's in a high school where the ban has been imposed, and the ban not only within the classroom but in the whole school. So when they come in the morning, they have to put their phone in the locker, which means they can't use it during the pause as well, is I've always felt, not because I'm a political philosopher, just because I'm a citizen, but the stuff I'm up against as a parent are just so immense that as an individual, there is no way that I can handle these things. And I'm just praying constantly for somebody to come around and make collective decisions, because we can't do this on our own. The children certainly can't do it on their own. The parents can't either. And this is an example where we've come together in a sense and said, this problem is a big one. We need to handle it in a way where we're taking away almost that liberty of individuals to make decisions about this, because it's clear that it's having some negative effect on their cognitive capital and our cognitive capital. So let's make this happen in a way where there's really no discussion about it and no need to practice our autonomy there. Let's practice it in places where it's more important, I would say. So I'm really happy with that. Yeah.
Do you recognize this idea that it's hard to resist phones or to make proper decisions?
Of course, these technologies, hijack our motivation, hijack our attention, and in a way take some of our decision autonomy away from us. The other interesting aspect of this is this kind of social component, that I think there's many surveys which show that if you ask individual children, would you want to give up your phone? They say no. But if you say, would you want everyone to give up their phones? They say yes. So there's a sense also of the kind of social environment here, that I recognize this isn't best for me, but the thought of being an outlier, that everyone else is connected, is even worse. So I think these policies have a nice feature, that they kind of bring everybody back to the same state, which I think can be, in general, enhancing for the group, the collective.
Yeah, I suppose it would be difficult to put a sort of an economic bottom line on a policy like this, but it's easier perhaps to...
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting example, and my intuitions about this are intuitions and based on anecdote and I think they create research questions of when you take the phones away, what do you get back? Like what's the counterfactual that was absent? Yeah. And is it my anecdotal information idea, and this is an empirical question, is it's that development of self-regulatory abilities. So, and my intuition is such only because of my own, when I'm struggling, when I'm particularly stressed out, or if I'm having like a low mood period, I'm on my phone more and slightly more compulsively. And when I'm there, I'm not addressing whatever the emotions are, whatever needs to be kind of regulated and managed. I'm not addressing it directly, perhaps indirectly, and perhaps there's a place for that after serious trauma or in deep periods of grief where there's something like that needs to be attentionally demanding without being emotionally demanding, such as a game on your phone. And there's, I think, some evidence that playing through to help work through serious trauma, but there are also, again, desirable levels of difficulty, and in a high school setting, the subtle social interactions and the real-time social interactions and making them social mistakes that make you into a more socially capable adult are not lessons that we're learning in the classroom. They're lessons that we're learning and that we're probably not learning if our faces are in our phones. But these are questions we need to follow up on. Like, are the generations, or will the Dutch children who had their phones banned show more skill at subtle social behaviors than American teenagers who are constantly on their phones? And these kind of natural experiments with not ideal control situations, but this is the best we're going to do in terms of gathering data about these things.
So I just wanted to say, certainly we have to follow up on this, and I sure hope they will be doing research on this following what's happening, and my personal joy is more intuitive than scientific here. But I can say that in terms of what we gain back, I heard immediately from our son in the first week that suddenly he said, yeah, the breaks, they're much noisier, and there's like stuff flying around, and this is good stuff, right? I mean, they shouldn't be getting hurt, and I don't know what, but something good is happening there in the sense that they're more active. The decibel levels are much higher. And I've heard the teachers say as well, yeah, we suddenly have to be a lot more busy during the breaks because stuff is happening and we have to manage it and regulate it. But that sounds to me like a good thing, so we've already gotten
they're probably creating more childhood memories than they would be if they're consistently using effectively the same rectangular environment.
Yeah, and so the phone is clearly like a very visible aspect of our digital society. So we've made a nice little segue into our minds in digital societies. There's broader risks, I suppose, and digitalization, you know a lot about this, it extends beyond the phone, I suppose.
Sure.
Do you see mostly risks, or do you see opportunities for using what we know about how we make decisions to prosper in a digital world?
So my job is to see the risks. This is what I do. It's my bread and butter. So I really focus on risks. That's not to say that there aren't opportunities and benefits, but there's enough people studying that so that the few of us can focus on risks. I see many risks. Actually, I tend to see two big ones. If we talk about digitalization and society, broadly speaking, or this move towards a digital society, and it's that it's not only our children and social media, it's not only us as citizens or consumers, but it's the very basic sectors or societal spheres that make up our society, which are being transformed by digitalization. And these spheres have been built around specific values and norms and types of expertise, which in the work that I'm doing, we see are coming into quite some tension with the values that digitalization is kind of importing or bringing, so to speak, from its original sphere, which is the ICT sector. And those are things like efficiency and speed and convenience and personalization, which can clash with something like collaboration and socialization in the educational sphere.
So what are some of these other spheres or core spheres where these values
So
are?
I'm looking a lot at healthcare,
Healthcare.
for example, but education is one, public administration is another one, agriculture is another one, and in each of these spheres have been traditionally organized around certain core fundamental values and norms and expertise. And digitalization kind of comes and sweeps those or sometimes marginalizes them or crowds them out, and that's one of the risks. I call that risk corruption, but there's another big one that we're focusing on at the research, in a research project I'm looking at, is that the digitalization tends to come with specific actors. I mean, the main actors who are developing and implementing and pushing digitalization today are big tech. It's a handful of very large private American corporations. And they're moving in. We've studied how big tech is having more and more influence in the healthcare sector, but they've moved in the past decade into every sector which is undergoing digitalization. We now find Google, Apple, Amazon, et cetera. And they're starting to call some shots. So they're starting to make decisions about things like research agendas. They're starting to have a say on where funding goes. They're extracting value from these societal spheres in ways that does not come back to the public sector. That's not to talk about privacy and data protection risks, which are the obvious ones. So these are really big risks, I think, that as a society we face and that we should be really careful about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alan, do you feel like in your bubble you're affected by digitalization, like in a methodical way?
I always enjoy talking with Tamar on this because I get to be the sunny optimist. Focuses on all that. So all of these risks notwithstanding, which are of course are very important, I do see there are opportunities, I think, with digitalization in my field. We make decisions pretty well. Most of us, we've all somehow found your way here tonight, and you'll probably mostly find your way home. We do pretty well. And each of you is the product of however many iterations and generations of people who've, made good enough decisions to at least last long enough to reproduce. So, good job, everybody. But we know there are flaws to our decision making. We know there's very systematic ways that we make decision errors. So, I see a real potential for digital technology in helping us make better decisions. So, this is often subsumed under the notion of kind of smart systems, which I don't like that term. I think wise systems is a better way to think about it.
What's it?
Wise systems. So this systems which have some wisdom to them which will help us overcome the fairly well-known limits and flaws in our decision-making skills. So I would see a role for technology in helping us, for example, think through all the aspects of our decision. We know very well, we tend to think in terms of option A or option B, the status quo or this other thing. I'm going to stay home tonight or go to Radboud Reflects. And we often get locked into these two options. But of course, there's many, many options. I could go to the movies. I could do this, that, or the other. So decision technology can help us, I think through our decisions in a non-judgmental or non-too overt way, but encourage us to think through the outcomes of the decisions. And I think has the potential to reduce these well-known biases in our decision-making, which often lead to suboptimal outcomes. Having said that, I think all of these attendant risks are there, and so we have to be very careful about who controls our data, who decides what the system is advising. But I think there is a path that may be a useful use of technology in decision making.
So if implemented correctly or in a specific manner.
Yeah, it's a very big if, but I think it's possible that it could be helpful for scenarios.
Emily, do you see specific risks when it comes to digitalization and collective cognitive capital?
Yes.
Some trends that you find worrisome or?
Yeah, and I again, working from anecdote and kind of personal experience, I have encountered this most directly as an educator, working in higher ed with students who are under enormous pressures to achieve and to get a job in a very competitive market. And then at least I teach law students, and American law schools are extremely expensive. Like even state-funded schools, nominally state-funded public schools like my school, our tuition is north of $55,000 a year, and that's the cheap ones. So I graduated from law school over a decade ago with $100,000 in debt, and that was actually a pretty low amount, and we've since paid it off, but the stakes are extremely high. And what I rebel against as an educator, notwithstanding the sympathies for the very high personal and economic stakes that students are taking on, especially when they have massive debt, is the sort of credentialism, trying to get through the system, to get the top grade, to get to the other side. And we've saw in COVID, and we've seen, I think, a massive expansion in cheating in undergraduate coursework throughout the United States. And not to say that using digital technology, such as generative AI, is cheating, but it's certainly not what I think of as learning. Right? Tamar was saying this morning, I think, that it's writing. It's the process of writing that is the process of thinking. And it's as an educator, and again, not someone schooled in the theories of education, but as an educator, what I'm trying to teach students when I'm teaching them law, when we're teaching law, we're not translating a body of knowledge. We don't say, here are all the laws, please repeat them back to me. Anybody can look that up. Unfortunately, we still test on memorization, but what I'm trying to teach is a set of skills. It's fundamentally skills about how to frame facts, how to apply law to a set of facts, how to discover what additional facts you need to know, and how to make judgments based on accumulated knowledge and accumulated wisdom, and then how to translate those things for a client. But if my students are using ChatGPT or Cloud to write, to give me the output so I can assess their thinking process, I don't know that it's happening. And I think this became particularly acute for me when I've started exploring this. We have a mandate in our university to try figuring out how to incorporate AI into legal education. And the reason for that is because it's getting shockingly good. It's getting good enough to do, I would say, first to fourth year associate working lawyer level work, which in many ways is great because that work is very tedious. I tell my students, your first jobs as a litigation attorney are going to be essentially managing information flow. You are moving information around and managing facts, but you are not doing deep legal thinking or deep constitutional strategy. It's just not what it's about. But in so doing, you start to develop the judgment so you eventually get to, like, law is a practice. But if we don't need those associates, and at the same time, the students are not learning as much as they can in school because they're producing output, the whole system's going to collapse. I don't know.
De-skilled.
They're de-skilled, and also there's no more market for those skills at the same time. If they're using it in school and firms are already using this, the upside to that, the opportunity, is that it's extremely expensive to get a lawyer in the United States, that most middle-class folks who need lawyers for basic life things, not even criminal defense attorneys, but managing an estate, managing a family dispute, a relatively minor civil dispute, significant for them, but not on the order of a corporate dispute. These things are out of reach. We call it an access to justice problem. You're only afforded a lawyer if you are an indigent criminal defendant, but tenants being evicted in most jurisdictions, San Francisco is different, are not given a lawyer. And if they can't afford one. So on one hand, cheaper technology is going to be a massive benefit. On the other hand, what's going to happen to these students who don't have the skills, aren't developing the skills, and are also taking on massive debt, and the jobs are gone?
And I suppose it's not just law students, but it's anyone for whom writing is the output of thinking. And if you replace, I think you made this point earlier today. Yeah. So
That's
and
right.
I have the same problem. I have students in philosophy, and they can write their papers using ChatGPT. And they're funny.
And they're not bad.
No, exactly. Yeah, some of the best stuff I've read, actually. So. Some are actually really funny.
It's definitely the writing quality is better.
So I usually
That's how you recognize it.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So I make this analogy where I say usually, and we're gonna go do audience questions in just 1 minute. So, but usually I make this analogy where I say it used to be the case that a student needed to become very good at playing an instrument, and that would be the pen, right? So you were part of an orchestra, and you had to play the trumpet, for example, or the violin, and you had to become a master of this instrument. But now the focus shifts where if you want to produce texts, you're no longer actually playing the instrument, you're orchestrating. So you're the conductor. Yeah. So you have to say to ChatGPT, a bit more of that, a bit more of this. Mm-hmm. So I suppose it's a different kind of skill, but something is lost. I think we need to figure out quickly what that is exactly.
So my experience of using it is for my work. So for example, coming up with a hypothetical for class. I'm not a creative story writer, so I need a little scenario of people, and I ask the machine, please give me a scenario of to illustrate the implied duty of good faith and fair dealing in contract law, and make it a close case. That was the prompt I gave it, and it was perfect.
Yeah.
It was useful. It was clear. It was in fact a close case, which is, how did it understand what I meant by that? That's a concept. It was phenomenally interesting, and it was a good use of my time. Instead of me spending an hour coming up with that, I could do it in 5 minutes. But when I use it for those tasks, I know I'm an editor. I'm not a creator, and that's okay, because I don't need to, that's not high value work for me. I have other things I'd like to do, like think about this stuff. But we need to be an editor. Well, how do you get to be an editor?
You need to be a writer first.
Yeah.
I think that's the real risk. And that, how do we develop, what is editing about? It's about expertise, but it's about judgment, and to some degree it's about taste. How do we develop these things other than through kind of harder won experience? I'm not sure.